So, now that I'm going to start the presentation, full screen. So, hello and welcome to my Prezi presentation. Today's topic will be covering Vietnam's origins and rise to independence. So, let's start with a little introduction. So, Vietnam was one of the most successful countries in Asia to gain independence during the early mid-20th century. And let's start with its origin story. So China basically ruled Vietnam for around 1,000 years before Vietnam finally gained independence in AD 938. But even then, they were always under Chinese attack and influence. So this went on for another couple of hundreds of years, as you can see. Well, basically 1,000 years. This began to change once we hit the 19th century, where the Western powers began to take interest in Asia, or in particularly Indochina, or even more particularly, France began to take interest in Indochina, and particularly Vietnam. And in the year 1885, the France defeated the Chinese and gained control of Vietnam in the French-Sino War. So after the French gained command and control of Vietnam, they began to establish the Indo-Chinese Union in 1893, and this combines Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos into one basic union. However, the French allowed local leaders to generally operate as they should, but they imposed this divide and rule structure, basically pitting nations against each other by emphasizing their cultural difference, thus discouraging uprising and independent movements. Yet, at the same time, the Vietnamese were still really unequal. They felt really mistreated by the French. This examples such as tax inequalities, and the peasants were forced to work on the French plantations and farms and mines just to pay back taxes. And the French also imposed monopoly on daily necessities. There were many uprisings during the period, but they were really, basically the French crushed them all. Then in 1930, the first Communist Party was founded by Ho Chi Minh. This is a picture of him when he was young, since no one ever sees him when he was young. We only see him when he was old. So I thought this might be a very more original take. So it is important to note that the communists weren't the only nationalist organization around during this period. There was the Cao Dai, which was the third biggest religion of Vietnam, and it split in 1946, with many of its members allying themselves with the French. And there were a few of them that also that ended up allying themselves for the communists, but it wasn't really important. The other organization was the Huang, which basically raised its own private army, but it still split in 1947, and with a lot of its members allying themselves with the French. So, one of the reasons why the Communist Party managed to maintain its influence for so long, because of its ideology in uniting all the people in Vietnam together. And yeah. It's very focused on just liberating Vietnam and gaining independence. So it managed to appeal to a lot of the peasants. Unfortunately, the Communist Party fared no better when it comes to confronting the French in actual military battle. Throughout the 1930s, multiple attempts were made to establish organization routes in villages, but they were all crushed by the French when they found out. And subsequently, Ho was banished out of Vietnam, returned in 1940 only to be crushed again. Ho's chance, however, came during the Second World War. In 1940, the Second World War begins. The French evacuated out of Vietnam after being swiftly and easily defeated by the Germans, and the Japanese took over. And here's the thing: with France's defeat, Japan's basically steamrolling across Asia. The Vietnamese begin to realize that the myth of the white supremacy is basically broken by then. They realize that, hey, the Western powers aren't that powerful after all, and now that they're killing themselves off, we can begin to have our own uprising. And when Ho began to actively resist the Japanese, he began to receive aid from the Allies. When Vietnam proved itself to be the only thing in Asia capable of at least resisting the Japanese, China not included. The KMT even offered warlords to train the Vietnamese in guerrilla warfare against the Japanese with equipment sponsored by the US. when Japan realized that, hey, Vietnam is beginning to actually drive us out, they began to reduce military presence by putting a puppet emperor named Bao Dai, a Vietnamese puppet emperor named Bao Dai, in power under false pretense that, Vietnam is still under, French rule. In 1945, the Communist Party was disbanded and reformed under the name of Viet Minh. So before then, the Viet Minh does not actually exist until 1945. It was known as the Communist Party of Vietnam. Only now in 1945 does they actually disband it and rename it the Viet Minh as we know now. But once the war is over, France basically ignored the Viet Minh, actually won. The Viet Minh is now basically in control of Vietnam, and they once more occupied Vietnam. Unfortunately, the Viet Minh now basically controls the island. So with the help, basically being backstabbed, the Viet Minh basically lost all Allied support after the war, and the British, Japanese, and French forces effectively pushed Ho's forces into the north. But unfortunately for the Allies, North Vietnam was to be given to China. Chiang Kai-shek was too busy dealing with his own communist problem, basically fighting his own civil war to properly control North Vietnam. And subsequently, Ho was able to establish establish the controls. So once the Vietnam is pushed away, the majority of French forces arrive to retake control. But now Ho is ready. He's deadly, and he shall have his vengeance. And I guess that's about it.